Chapter 5. The Quiet Claim. The old woman scrambled across kitchen tiles, skidding on a smear of something dark and wet. It had the texture of cold tallow, a slick film that offered no grip, and it was utterly without scent. The absence of smell unsettled her more than any stench might have done. Her shoulder found the wood of the back door, muscles bunching beneath her thin cardigan as she pushed. The door frame groaned, but held fast. The new bolt Huseevo had fitted, catching the light like a malevolent eye. She set her weight against it properly, feeling the old joints in her spine protest. The bolt was a single, heavy bar of iron, an ugly, brutal thing against the clean, white cupboards. It looked wrong, felt wrong, raw and unforgiving. The metal had been fitted with screws that didn't quite align. She could see where they'd chewed the wood, leaving pale splinters. Her fingers grazed its surface and felt the coarse, rasping bite of metal against her skin, enough bite to take skin. Her breath snagged. The next one wouldn't quite come. She turned from the door, a frantic thing now, and in the silence that followed she listened. The clock above the sink wasn't ticking. The fridge coughed once and fell silent. Even the house itself seemed to have drawn breath and held it. A mental inventory of neighbours ran through her mind with the desperate efficiency of someone counting coins for the rent. The Joneses, next door, were on holiday. She'd seen them load their car 3 days ago, arguing over suitcases while their little terrier yapped from the back seat. Mrs. Davies, across the street, was deaf as a post, would be watching her evening programmes with the volume turned up enough to rattle her windows. The milkman wouldn't be by until morning, and even then, he was that new lad who barely looked old enough to drive, let alone notice an old woman's distress. She was alone. The realization settled in her like a stone in a shoe. A tiny voice in her head, the voice of her late husband, Reynold, whispered, "Silly old woman, it's just the lad. He's had a rough night." Reynold's voice was a low, comforting murmur, familiar as her own reflection. He'd always been there to talk sense into her when she let her imagination run away. But the voice felt different now, carried a weight it hadn't possessed in life. "Look at you," he continued, and there was something sharp in it now, something that made her spine straighten. "Getting yourself worked up over nothing. What would the neighbours think?" Her eyes found the open cellar door, a black gap where the wall should have stayed whole. A cold shard of ice ran straight through her from throat to belly. "It's just a cellar," she told herself. "Nothing to be scared of. Every house has one." But the dark seemed too complete, as if it were drinking the light from the kitchen. "Don't you go down there," Ronald's voice said, and the change in tone made her freeze. It was no longer the patient, slightly condescending voice of her living husband. This was sharp, urgent. The house takes what it's owed." The words, a jumble of nonsense, had been a constant refrain in his last fevered days when the cancer had eaten away at more than just his body. She'd always dismissed them as the ramblings of a sick man, the morphine talking. But now, in this silence, the words held a terrible weight. They seemed to echo off the walls, resonating in frequencies she could feel in her bones. "Leave that bolt alone," Reynolds said. "Come away from there." But her feet were already moving, drawn by something stronger than sense. She took a step towards the cellar door. Then another. The temperature dropped with each step, as if she were walking into winter itself. She descended, one hand on the cold stone wall, the other to her chest. The cotton of her blouse felt too thin, too insubstantial against what waited below. She could feel the dampness seep, the cold of the cellar, a living thing, a hungry thing that bit and gnawed. The stairs were uneven, worn smooth by decades of feet, slick with a fine layer of dust and a strange, oily residue that clung to her fingertips. Each step down was a small betrayal of everything sensible. Her feet moved with a hesitant, shuffling rhythm. The left slipper had worked loose at the heel, and you could feel it sliding with each step, threatening to send her tumbling into the dark. On the 7th step, or thereabouts, the hem of her dress snagged on a stray nail, and she had to tug at it, the small violence of the fabric tearing, seeming unnaturally loud in the silence. She ripped it free. "Count them," she told herself, falling back on the childhood habit. 1, 2, 3. But the numbers seemed to slip away from her, replaced by the rhythm of something else, a slow, irregular dripping that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls wept with moisture, beads of water catching what little light filtered down from the kitchen. She tried to make sense of the space, to orient herself in the familiar geography. This should be directly under his kitchen, which meant the water heater would be to her left, the old coal bunker to her right, but nothing felt familiar in this thick, dark. At the bottom of the stairs, the dark had weight. It swallowed her whole, a thing with a presence that pressed in on her from all sides. She stood there, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, her mind scrambling for explanation, for reason, for a way back to the world she knew. This was not the ordered universe she'd always believed in, where good Christian folk lived quiet lives and went peacefully to their rest. This was someplace else entirely. A place where the old, safe rules had been suspended. "Don't touch anything," Reynolds warned. "Don't you touch anything down here." But she was already reaching out. One hand held in front of her like a blind person's cane, her fingers stiff with arthritis and cold, brushed against something soft and disturbingly warm. She pulled her hand back as if she'd been burnt, and the thing, whatever it was, shifted beside her with a low, moaning sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken. She fumbled in her pocket for the lighter she kept there, the one she used for the church candles when it was her turn to help with the flowers. Her thumb, swollen with age and stiff with cold, fumbled on the wheel. It scraped twice against the flint, a dry whisper that only amplified the terrible silence. Heat built under her thumb, but no light came. On the third strike, a small yellow flame flickered to life. The sharp smell of sulphur filled the air, acrid and brief, and in its small, trembling circle of light, she saw him. Oliver Henderson, the young Jehovah's Witness who'd come to her door just last week with his earnest face and his carefully prepared scriptures. He was huddled against the stone wall, his white shirt torn and stained dark. His face, pale and ashen, was streaked with a thin, dark line of dried blood that had run from his scalp to his collar. His head lolled on his chest, and his eyes, wide and unseeing, stared at a point far beyond her. But his lips were moving, forming words in a thin, dry whisper. "For God so loved the world." He coughed, a terrible rattling sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest, and a thin crimson froth bubbled on his lips. The sight of it made her stomach turn, made her want to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there in that small circle of flickering light. "You've had a fall," she heard herself say, the words thin and foolish, the kind she kept for toddlers and very old. "Up you get. We'll get you sorted." Oliver's eyes tracked badly, like a clock hand that sticks, and found her face. For a moment, something like relief flickered there. "Is there any hope for the dead?" he asked, and she recognized the words from his last visit, when he'd stood on her doorstep with his briefcase and his unshakable faith. "Of course there is, love," she said, though her voice sounded strange in her own ears. "Of course there is." But even as she spoke, she could see he was slipping away from her. His breathing was shallow, laboured, and when he spoke again, the words came broken and scattered. "That whosoever believeth in him should not perish." The flame guttered, wavering as her hands shook. She brought it closer without meaning to, and the heat climbed her knuckle. In the better light, she could see more detail she didn't want to see. The way his shirt had been cut, sharp, deliberate work. The dark stains that weren't just blood, but something that had soaked into the fabric and dried to a rusty brown. And behind him, barely visible in the flame's reach, the mouth of a sack tied with brown cord. A thread frayed there as if something had picked at it with a nail. And she could see the shape of something inside, something that filled the sack with an irregular bulk that made her mind shy away from questions. "We'll get help," she said, though the words felt hollow. "We'll get you to a hospital." Oliver coughed again, and this time what came up was too dark, too thick. "For the dead," he added, and the words came out with a wet sound that didn't belong in human speech. The flame guttered and died. In the absolute darkness that followed, the copper scent intensified. She could taste it now, coating her tongue with an unpleasant film that made her want to retch. The dripping sound grew louder, more insistent, and she found herself counting again without meaning to. Drip, 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 drip. She scrambled away from Oliver, her body moving in a sideways scuttle she didn't recognize as her own. Her skirt caught on something else. A nail, a splinter? She couldn't tell, and she heard the cotton tear. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, a small violence that echoed off the stone walls. Her hand found something else, something that gave way beneath her palm with a horrible, yielding softness. She snatched it back, but not before her fingers registered the texture. Cloth, wet, with something that wasn't water, and underneath it, something that had once been warm and was now cooling. "Don't think about it," she told herself. "Don't think about what it is." But her mind, treacherous thing, was already working, already cataloguing possibilities. The shape, the size, the terrible stillness of it. Another person, another victim. How many were down here? How many had simply vanished from the quiet streets, swallowed by this ordinary house with its neat garden and its tidy curtains? She found the stairs again, her hand scrabbling for something to steady herself on the cold stone. The surface was slick with condensation, and her fingers slipped, scraping against the rough mortar between the stones. One nail caught and tore, a small, sharp pain that brought tears to her eyes. She was going back up to the world of reason, to the world of her home, to the world of her faith. She would find a way to get out, to tell someone, to tell the police. She would tell them all. She was a woman of faith, a woman who had lived her whole life doing the right thing, and she would not let this stand. Her mind was already composing the words, the phrases, the terrible testimony she would give, but even as she climbed, she could feel the weight of the darkness behind her, pressing at her back like a physical thing. "The house takes what it's owed," Reynolds' voice said again, and this time there was no comfort in it, only a grim certainty that made her blood run cold. She was halfway up when she heard it. The soft creak of a floorboard from above. Not the random settling of an old house, but the deliberate pressure of a foot. Someone was walking across the kitchen, moving, with the careful tread of someone who knew exactly where each board would sing. She stopped, her body rigid. The sound came again, closer to the cellar door now. She held her breath, her chest tight with a desperate prayer. "Please, don't come down here, please." But the footsteps continued, moving with that strange, unnatural grace she'd noticed in Huseevo, as if he were a body that had been moving in this house for generations, a body that knew every creak, every groan, every sigh of the floorboards. "Run," Ronald's voice urged. "Run now, while you still can." But there was nowhere to run. The cellar had only one entrance, and whoever was above controlled it. She was trapped, down here, with Oliver, and the sacks and whatever else Huseevo kept in his private darkness. "Oh, there you are, my dear," came a voice from above. Soft, familiar. It was Hannah. Hannah, the kind council worker girl who had helped her fill out the forms for Reynolds' pension, who had held her hand at the funeral and brought round casseroles in the weeks that followed. Mrs. Crabtree's heart surged with desperate relief. Here was salvation, here was help, here was someone from the normal world who would see this horror and put it right. "Hannah," she called up, her voice cracked and desperate. "Hannah, help me. There's something terrible down here. Call the police. Call someone." But even as she spoke, something in the quality of the silence above made her pause.
From behind Hannah, another stepped into the stair. Even from a distance, Huseevo's presence was undeniable. His eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity in the shadows. Two dark flames of ancient fire, cold and without mercy. Mrs. Crabtree watched, frozen as he lifted his arms, his hands reaching, fingers splayed, ready to encircle Hannah's throat, a gesture of chilling intent, a promise of violence. Mrs. Crabtree looked on, helpless, a scream trapped behind her swollen tongue, a petrified, futile plea. Hannah turned to face Huseevo, her face a mask of abject terror, her eyes wide with a horrifying understanding, a dawning realization of the monstrous truth. Huseevo had the same intense, chilling look that he had worn when he had had Steve pinned to the wall, a look that promised absolute, inescapable control, a cold, primeval power that seemed to emanate from his very being. Then the world tilted. Huseevo and Hannah burst out laughing, a sudden, jarring sound that echoed unnervingly in the stone chamber, a shared, intimate sound, a grotesque connivance that sent a shiver of despairing revulsion through Mrs. Crabtree. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated malice, a chilling contrast to the horror, a sound that would have haunted her nightmares, though the only sleep possible now would be the eternal. They wrapped their arms around each other, a brief, horrifying embrace, a silent affirmation of their shared, terrible purpose, a grotesque display of affection. Mrs. Crabtree watched, confused, shocked, her mind struggling to comprehend, to reconcile this monstrous reality with the mundane world she knew, a world that had suddenly, irrevocably shattered. Huseevo and Hannah turned, their faces still stretched in that chilling, shared mirth. Mrs. Crabtree began to shake her head slowly, a denial that reverberated through her body, through her very soul, a desperate protest against the truth that was unfolding before her. She backed up, slowly, blindly. The light from the open doorway above them, already thin, receded with their descent, swallowing them back into the gloom from which they seemed to have emerged, into the deeper, older darkness that now claimed her. The darkness deepened around the fraudulent housekeeper, pressing in, oppressive, stealing her breath. She crouched, trapped between the fading light of the surface world and the deepening abyss where her horrifying captors advanced, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow, that no amount of Christian charity or sensible advice would save her now.
"Mother," Huseevo said, and the word carried weight, carried history, carried love of a kind that had nothing to do with the natural order of things. Hannah reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture both tender and obscene. Her voice when she spoke was the same mild, helpful tone she'd used to explain council procedures and benefit applications. "It won't take long, dear. We keep things tidy." Mrs. Crabtree's mind reeled, shopping desperately for labels that might make sense of this. Incest, devil worship, madness. Each label slid off. None of them fit what she was seeing. This was something else, something that belonged to an older world. A world where the boundaries between life and death, between mother and child, between past and present, had worn thin. I don't understand," she said, though part of her did. Part of her had been understanding since the moment she'd seen that iron bolt on the door. "Of course you don't," Hannah said gently. "How could you? But it doesn't matter now. What matters is that you're here, and you're the right age, and you have so much life left to give." The air grew heavier as they approached, thick with expectation. Nowhere to hide in this ice-cold stone chamber. Mrs. Crabtree could smell something else now underneath the copper and damp, a faint cloying sweetness that made her think of communion wine and Sunday morning services. But this was communion of a different sort, a sacrament that belonged to older gods and darker purposes. "Please," she whispered, though she no longer expected mercy. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong." "No, dear," Hannah agreed. "You haven't. That's rather the point." Above them, Mrs. Crabtree thought she heard the soft pad of feet, the whisper of something moving across the kitchen floor. The cat, perhaps. Eeshmeroosh with the unsettling intelligence and the golden eyes that saw too much. Her mind, in the extremity, fled to memory. She saw herself at 23 walking down the aisle of St. Mary's in her white dress, with Reynold waiting at the altar. She saw the reception afterwards, the speeches and the dancing, the way Reynold had held her close during their first dance as husband and wife. She saw their first house, smaller even than the one she lived in now, and the way they'd painted the kitchen together on a Saturday afternoon, getting more paint on each other than on the walls. She saw herself at 40, standing in the doctor's office and hearing the words that would define the rest of their marriage. "I'm sorry, but there's very little chance of children." She saw the years that followed, the quiet meals and the comfortable silences, the way love had settled into something smaller, but no less real. She saw Reynolds' final illness, the way it had eaten him from inside, leaving behind someone else, leaving behind someone she barely recognized. The rambling, the fever dreams, the constant talk of houses and debts and things that were owed. She had thought it was delirium, but now she wondered if dying men might see more clearly than the living. "Every house in this street has a cellar," he had said one night, his hand gripping hers with surprising strength. "But not every cellar is the same. Some of them remember things. Some of them are hungry." She had hushed him then, had given him his medication and smoothed his pillows. But his words came back to her now, with terrible clarity. The light from the kitchen above seemed to dim, or perhaps her vision was failing. Hannah and Huseevo stood before her now like figures from a nightmare. But their faces held no malice, no cruelty, only a kind of patient love, the love of parents for a difficult child who must be corrected. "It will be quick," Hannah promised. "We've had so much practice, you see, decades of it. And afterwards, you'll be part of something beautiful, something eternal." "The blood that binds," Huseevo added, and his voice carried the weight of ritual, of words spoken countless times in this same stone chamber. Mrs. Crabtree closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her lids, she saw one final vision. A dining room, warm with candlelight, set with fine china and crystal glasses. At one end of the table sat a woman who might have been Hannah, her hair done different. At the other end, a boy of perhaps 10, his face familiar, though she couldn't place where she'd seen it before. Between them lay a feast, roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables from someone's garden, and bottles of wine that caught the candlelight like rubies. But it was the liquid in their glasses that held her attention. Dark red, slow in the glass, thicker than wine. They raised their glasses in unison, and their smiles were identical. The smile of shared knowledge, of hunger about to be satisfied. The boy's voice, when he spoke, was Huseevo's voice, made younger and clear. "To mother," he said. "To my son," she replied. They drank together, and the liquid left dark stains on their lips, stains that looked like kisses in the flickering light. Around them, the shadows seemed to dance, to celebrate, to join in their ancient communion. Mrs. Crabtree opened her eyes to find Hannah's face very close to her own. The woman's breath smelled of damp mushrooms and roses, of things both beautiful and hidden. "Do you see now?" Hannah asked softly. "Do you understand what you're becoming part of?" Mrs. Crabtree tried to speak, but found she had no voice left. The cellar was growing darker, or perhaps was her vision fading. The dripping sound had become a rhythm, a heartbeat, a lullaby that promised sleep.
The cellar exhaled its final, damp breath, drawing her deeper into its cold silence, a hungry, old entity claiming its due.
The darkness took her then, gentler than she'd expected. The drip kept time, then went. Taste thinned to metal, touch to cold air, sight to a bead of light. When that pinprick closed, the house kept its quiet.